Today, we are diving deep into a really provocative paper by Sixbert Sangwa. It's called When Babel Becomes Beautiful, and it asks a radical question. What if all this cultural blending we celebrate, this thing we call unity, is actually a dangerous kind of confusion? Yeah, let's get into it.
So, Sangwa kicks things off with the Tower of Babel, but he's not looking at it just as ancient history. For him, it's a huge warning sign. The idea here is that when human ambition goes unchecked, even when it's wrapped in the language of unity, it can lead to some serious confusion. And that tension, right there, between a beautiful goal and a potentially disastrous outcome, that's the key to his entire argument.
And that ancient story brings us to this very, very modern question. I mean, think about it. We're told our whole lives that blending cultures, ideas, and beliefs is progress. It's the way forward. But Sangwa stops us in our tracks and makes us ask, is it though? Or are we just repeating an old mistake, building a new kind of Babel, and we don't even see it?
To really explain how this new Babel works, Sangwa introduces a powerful metaphor. He says we've moved on from a tower of brick and mortar. Now we're building what he calls the painted tower.
So here's the picture he paints. You've got all these different tribes, and each one has its own unique paint. Their beliefs, their symbols, their rituals, they all come together to paint this one giant tower. And yeah, on the surface it looks like unity, it looks beautiful. But Sangwa argues it's just a superficial blend that's actually hiding a deep spiritual confusion. And he gives some pretty pointed examples. Crosses tattooed right next to chakras, or Christian conferences bringing in Buddhist meditation techniques. He's saying that in this process of blending, something absolutely essential about each thing is getting lost.
This idea of a painted tower leads us right to the philosophical heart of his whole critique. He argues that this constant, relentless blending is causing what he calls the death of distinction.
Now, when Sangwa says distinction, it's easy to think he means division or hostility, but for him, that's not it at all. He sees distinction as the very source of meaning. He points back to the very beginning, in Genesis, the separation of light from darkness, of land from sea. He sees those as divine acts that create order out of chaos. From his perspective, our modern world is trying to erase all those essential lines, and he sees that as a fundamentally destructive act.
And this sets up the central conflict of his paper. It's a real clash of worldviews. On one side, you have his argument. Distinction is what preserves meaning. It preserves life itself. And on the other side, you have what he calls the modern creed, this belief that blending all our differences is the only way to get to peace and love. But Sangwa looks at that modern peace and calls it something else entirely: chaos wearing cologne.
He really drives this point home with these powerful rhetorical questions. His whole argument is that when you blend things that have distinct, separate purposes, they don't make each other better. They cancel each other out. Salt mixed with sugar is useless for preserving. Light mixed with darkness is just gray. It doesn't illuminate anything. For Sangwa, the blend itself is the problem.
So, to show us what this loss of distinction actually looks like in the real world, Sangwa tells these short, stark stories he calls parables of perishing. They're meant to illustrate the real-world consequences of all this blending.
Okay, first, there's the parable of the river. This river wants to be accepting, so it welcomes every single stream that comes its way. The pure ones, the muddy ones, even the toxic ones. And in the author's telling, this river gets incredibly broad and full, but it loses its freshness, its current, its very identity. It becomes a metaphor for a culture or a faith that accepts everything, and because of that, it ends up standing for nothing.
And then there's the choir. This one's a powerful image. In a search for what he thinks is perfect unity, a conductor asks every distinct voice, the soprano, the bass, the tenor, to forget their part and just blend into one single uniform tone. Well, the result isn't harmony, right? Harmony needs distinct notes working together. Instead, what they get is a lifeless, monotonous hum. The song literally dies from sameness.
Sangwa then takes these parables and aims them squarely at his ultimate target, the modern church. He argues these exact same dynamics are playing out right now. He talks about sermons that become wholly tasteless because they're trying so hard not to offend anyone. He talks about worship that feels more like a performance on a soundstage than an encounter in the Holy of Holies. For him, this isn't progress. It's a dangerous watering down of faith.
And he draws a very, very hard line with this statement. For Sangwa, there is a massive difference between appreciating another culture and actually absorbing its spiritual practices into your own faith. He argues that when you do that, it's not respect. It's a beautifully packaged betrayal of your core beliefs. He calls it apostasy with aesthetics.
He gives this practice a name: syncretism. And he says this is the Tower of Babel reborn. Only this time, it's not built with bricks. It's built with borrowed beliefs. In this kind of spiritual buffet model, he argues, Jesus isn't necessarily rejected outright, but he gets demoted. He becomes just another flavor, just one option among many. And for Sangwa, that is the ultimate danger of the blend.
Okay, so after that incredibly intense diagnosis of the problem, Sangwa turns to his prescription. He doesn't just critique and leave it there. He offers a solution, which he frames as an urgent call to return.
His call is for nothing less than a radical course correction. He's urging his readers to repent, which just means to turn away from these specific trends he sees as so compromising. He's talking about turning away from watered-down messages, from entertainment-based worship, from mixed spiritualities, and from dialogues where no one is willing to say what's true. It's really a demand for a return to unapologetic conviction.
He backs up this whole argument with biblical verses just like this one. This quote from the Apostle Paul is used to make the case for an absolute, non-negotiable separation. The idea is simple. Some things are just fundamentally incompatible. You can't hold them both at the same time. You have to choose. Sangwa concludes not with despair, but with a challenge, a final charge, really. He argues that the calling of a person of faith isn't to blend in, to conform to the culture around you. The calling, he says, is to blaze, to be a distinct, burning, unmistakable light. He points to figures like Daniel and Paul as the models for this, people who held on to their convictions even when it cost them everything. And so that leaves us right back where we started, wrestling with Sangwa's central challenge. In a world that almost universally agrees that blending cultures is the highest good, he forces us to stop and ask, what is the real price of that unity? When we erase every line and every distinction, what of real value might we be losing forever? It's a heavy question and one worth thinking about.